Recording. Let's see, today is October 12th, 2018. This is the regularly scheduled meeting, 10 o'clock meeting of ITSE 2309 at Collin College in beautiful downtown Frisco on a rainy Friday morning. Okay. Now, a couple of housekeeping announcements. Test one is posted. Okay. It times out at 1 minute till midnight on Monday. Okay, so get there, do it between now and midnight, 1 minute to midnight. I always make it time out at 1 minute till because there's a little equivocation. Is that 12 a.m. or 12 p.m.? Actually, it's kind of both. But I believe that officially it's a.m., but they're not. It's a little bit like between. Sometimes it's kind of strange, so I back up a minute. Anyway. Yeah, if you said, well, 12 p.m., usually you mean noon, but that's officially, that's meridian. So p.m. means post-meridian, a.m. means ante-meridian. I believe that the midnight is in the next day. It has to be one or the other. Mm-hmm. Yeah, if it were, it can't be in both. Okay, and I'm beginning module. What module is this? Okay, so we're going to check module 7. Module 7. And I want to check before to make sure that we can access the test one and everything's rolling along fine with it. So I have published it, and but every now and then I'll get it in an unpublished module or something, and unpublished over in the files, and everybody goes, "Oh, I can't get to the test." You see the the module, and I want to make sure that I can get to it fine. If I go into my student view, I can see the test. So that's fine. All right, today what we are doing in this one's kind of like, students have trouble with this one, but there's no reason to. It's not that difficult. What we're doing here just isn't a big deal. Should be able to get through it pretty quickly. Module 7 deals with what we call the aggregate functions. Aggregate data aggregation says add it up, count it, take the minimum, maximum, average it, something like that. Now, there are 5 of them that are traditionally covered in this course, and almost all the books cover the same 5. Okay, these are the average. Take an average of a group of numbers. Take the minimum of anything that I can compare. So it doesn't make any sense to average a person's name, but any number I can take an average, or I can take a sum, add them up, take an average. So that applies to numbers. The minimum and the maximum applies to either numbers or character data. Minimum means first in the dictionary, maximum means last in the dictionary, or numbers. And the other one is count. 1 little, 2 little, 3 little records. I'll talk about those. So we can have it right. Here's an example. Close this down. Select average invoice total as my average. Anytime that you have an aggregate function or anything else, you should alias the column name. So you should name it something. If you name it X, you should have some meaningful name that applies to it. So I'm using my AVG. So select average invoice total. So this is going to give me the average of it, what's in invoices. And if I execute this, I see that the average is, it's a little difficult see down there, but it worked. I don't really care what the average is. It's $18,079.74. Notice one thing about money. Money always appears having 4 decimal places. This is so that so money therefore translates to an integer. It'll always get rounded to an integer, and then the decimal point is shifted 4 places. So the smallest denomination of money in almost any currency has 4 decimal places. Commonly, we don't use 4. We commonly use 2, unless you're buying gasoline for some strange reason. We use 3 there. I don't know why. But there is a coin that exists, at least in somebody's mind, and probably there are a few of them at the United States Mint, just so we can say, here is one, such that 100 of them make a penny. It's called a mill. 1/10,000th of a dollar. Okay, it's not worth much. Therefore, they're not put out into circulation. But I was told once, I don't know whether it's true, I was told, well, it has to exist. So it does. But anyway, money is always calculated in 4 decimal places. And that's why you're seeing 4 decimal places on the average, because it's rounding to 4 decimal places. But most of the time we round to the nearest penny. Go ahead, please.
So average is the mean, right?
Average is the mean is one way to think about it. Well, mean, median, and mode. Mean is a statistical term which means average.
So basically adding up all terms, dividing, that's what
And numeric, that's what it is. Now, it might not be in statistics, populations and stuff like that. You talk about the population mean. Yes, you mean average. The median is the distance between the upper bound and the lower bound. Okay. So it just takes the average. Now, notice that this is one number. See one little number there that gives me back. So it takes the whole table, calculates one number. It's not going to stay that way very long. But right now, one number. You say AVG, you get one number. Similarly, max, you get one number. So I can tell you what the largest invoice is. The largest invoice is $37,966.19. They were just dying to know that, I'm sure. But the maximum, I can calculate the minimum the same way, min, max, AVG. Some of them, in some platforms, you will spell it out AVERAGE, average, okay? SQL Server, you don't. I believe in Excel, don't you spell it average if you're talking about the average over a range? I think you do. This isn't a class about Excel. If I execute the minimum, I will get one number, and the minimum invoice is $6. Minimum and maximum, no. So average, minimum, and maximum. Well, no, minimum and maximum, yes, definitely. So if my name is if I in the database I've got Al and Charlie and Dale and Jack, the minimum would be Al and the max would be Jack, where they would appear in the dictionary. No, minimum, what's it? Average would be an error because I can't average a name.
I was thinking about the situation where like you're alphabetically trying to put people, assign people to groups, you divide it in half or something like that.
You would count. Take a count and assign half and divide the count by 2 and assign half of them and half of them. Count is definitely an aggregate function, yes. I'm going to come to that. It's a little bit special. But I can't apply average to a name. Average has to be applied to a number of some kind, usually integers, but it could be a floating point. So if I say the average of something, it will round it to the nearest point of granularity, meaning if I only have integers 1, 2, 3, 4, I think it will round it. I'll have to test it most of the time. So it takes the average and gives you an integer. It might put decimal points on it, but I'll have to test that and find out. Okay, you got the minimum, maximum. That's pretty straightforward. The sum just adds them up. And when they add them all up, I get $214,290.51. And similarly, I can put them all together and execute in one swell foop. Double check my okay. So if I execute this, I just get them all on one line. That's fine, okay? Because I've got 4 numbers. Each one of them gives me one number. I have 4 numbers in my select line. That's fine. Question?
So what if after the comma you had a column that was just called invoice total? Would that list?
Well, it's better than having a straight man in the audience, because I'm just coming to that right now. Oh, okay. Let me do count first. Okay. This one's a little bit different. I'm saying, show me how many vendor address 2s do I have? Now remember, vendor address 1 is the address, and vendor address 2, I don't know what that really, I guess that rural route 3 or something like that. So if we have to go into 2 lines for the address, now how many vendors have a vendor address 2? So this is going to count not null vendor address 2s. Okay. If I select this, I think I get 19. So I have 19 vendor address 2s that aren't null. The rest of them, I think I have 122 rows in there. All of them but 19 are null. All right. What if I want to know how many rows are in the table? Okay, how many rows do I have in the table? Well, what's the primary key of vendors? The primary key of vendors is vendor ID. So if I count the vendor IDs, that's going to tell me how many rows I have. So I count it, and I find that I have 122 rows, because each row has to have a vendor ID. It's required. That's primary key. So I counted the primary keys. I used to teach middle school, believe it or not. I wasn't a very good middle school teacher. I guess I don't have that rigid sense of discipline and authority that the kids are going to. Anyway, one time I was talking to the kids and I said, okay, we're going to count noses. And so somebody was counting and he's going, 1, 2, excuse me, I can't see your nose, I can't, hey, turn around, I can't see your nose. Okay, there's a nose. Do I really care about noses?
Someone might have lost it.
Well, I'm aware of that, but my point being that I'm not counting any particular, I guess I count your ears and divide by 2. Yeah. I'm not interested if that's just a figure of speech. And I mean, how many people are in the room? Count any part of their anatomy you see. Okay. Now, when that's true about the count, what am I looking for here? All I'm interested in is how many rows. I'm not really interested in how many of the primary keys are not null. Well, up here, that was different. I'm interested in how many vendor address 2s do I have in the database that are not null. Now, that's a different question than how many rows. So if I go down and count the primary key, that's a little bit like telling that 7th grader to count noses. And now he puts a lot of effort into counting that nose, 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 nose. But you know, if you can't see your nose, then he's got to resolve each person's nose. What this makes the database do, it resolves the vendor ID. I don't care about the vendor ID. All I want to know is a row there. Okay, and if we can do that, this is much better from a database perspective. Count asterisk. Count anything that's there. If there is one field in that record, count it. If you have a record, count it. If it's got a primary key, good. If it doesn't, count it anyway. Yes.
The headings or the titles of those columns, does that count as row?
The headings and the title, no, that's just, you're talking about down here in the output where you have that, no, that's not a row. Yeah. How many rows, how many logical rows are in the database? Just the data. I don't care how you see it. Okay. So count anything, and if I execute this, I'll get the same count of 122, but I got it with less work on the database. Questions? Okay. Okay, now to your question a moment ago. Let me roll this down a little bit so I can get him on there. This particular one, select vendor ID and the average invoice total. Vendor ID is in invoices, the average invoice total is in invoices. It kind of goes to your question. Could you'd be in the same position if you tried to select invoice total and average invoice total. Average invoice total gives me one value. Vendor ID is going to give me back multiple values. Which one do we want? What average do I put there is the question. So if I try this, I'm going to get the error, and this is never going to change. It's never going to change. It says invoices.vendor.id is invalid in the select list because it is not contained in an aggregate function or the group by clause, and that's next thing coming up. Don't ask me what the group by clause is. That's coming right next. Okay? So, new rule.
I would have expected that.
New rule. What's that comedian that always does the new rules? He's on one of the cable channels. Bill Maher, rather vulgar sometimes.
I think he's like a talk show guy.
Well, he's talk comedian. New rule, and yeah, he actually, we at my old institution, he was going to be our keynote speaker. We threw a fit, our keynote speaker at the graduation. And sometimes they'll get celebrities and people like that. So, you know, if they had Stephen Colbert, it'd be fun. I'd go watch Stephen Colbert. But what's his name? Mayer is a bit on the vulgar side. So I just didn't want grandma being there. And so anyway, we nixed it finally. New rule. If you have any aggregate function, one or more aggregate functions, sum, min, max, average, count, and there are others, by the way. I have in the select line, I have one or more of them. And also in the select line, I have one or more non-aggregate fields, meaning vendor ID or just invoice total, invoice total. The non-aggregate field must be in a group by clause. This will never change. This rule applies in all database products. Okay, so there's nothing that you're going to go someplace else and find that it's different. Here we go. select vendor ID. I have one non-aggregate clause, one non-aggregate field, comma. I have at least one aggregate field. Happen to have two, doesn't matter. I have one. In fact, I have two, doesn't change anything. Don't care how many you have of either one. All of the non-aggregates must be in a group by clause. Now, what does group by do? Okay. What happens is it breaks it up by vendor ID and averages it and counts it within that. Okay. Some programming environments call this a control break, whatever. You average it, or you take the counts by store. So it's a group by. So I'm processing data for convenience stores, and I work for someone who has 20 convenience stores. And so I say group by store ID. So store ID 1, I see the average and the totals and the minimum and the maximum and the counts for that store. Store ID 2, I see the same information for that store. Store ID 3, so I have grouping by the store ID. Okay. You do not have to group by primary key. It would not make sense to say select invoice total, sum of the invoice total, or any other aggregate on invoice total, group by invoice total. For each invoice total, I'm going to have a special group of 1. No, that's not true. It wouldn't make much sense, because what you'd get would be invoice totals, and the sum of the invoice totals should be the same. Unless two invoices happen to have the same invoice total. In that case, they would collapse into one group.
Oh, it wouldn't just be, the sum wouldn't just be the value of that invoice?
I think, let me do this one. I can test it here. All I would have to do is put invoice total here and see, because I have a count. Let's run this one. Select. Yeah, I think it's worth considering it. What would happen? Most of the time, you're grouping. What am I interested in here? On the vendor IDs, okay? I want to see the average invoice total and how many invoice totals did each vendor ID have, okay? So group by vendor ID. The vendor ID is in the invoices table. It's a foreign key. So it can have duplicates. I can have multiple invoices for one vendor ID. And I'm saying order by my row count. Notice that I can use this alias down on the order by line. Let's see what we get. Notice that the greatest row count I have is 47 of them from vendor ID 123, and so on down, as I'm ordering by the row, by that my row count. Questions? Now let's see what would happen if we said select invoice total.
Is group by evaluated before select?
Let me think about that. Is group by evaluated? But no, group by would have to be evaluated after. I would expect it to be evaluated after select, but I cannot use the select alias. If I alias that, I can't use that down in the group by field, and I'll show that to you in a minute. Let's see. So if I select invoice total, I have to group by invoice total. What I'm expecting to see is a whole bunch of ones. So I'm expecting to see where the invoice total and the average invoice total are the same if there's just one of them. And so if we run this, goodness, I have 3 of them that are $6. I have 3 of them that match, but the average is, what's the average of all the invoices that are for $6? $6. Now, if I'd said some, it would have been 18. I've got 3 for $10. I have a few 2s, and the rest of them are all 1s. It looks to me like everything is, so it's kind of an exercise in futility, but nonetheless, it did make a point of seeing what's going on here. The fact is they're going to be the same. People will misuse group by. Suppose I were to group by a primary key. Duh. I'm guaranteed not to have any duplicates. So that doesn't make any sense to group by the primary key. So I say invoice ID is the primary key. Select invoice ID, sum of the invoice total. Group by the invoice ID. Every one of them is just going to have one record in it because the invoice ID is unique. That's a primary key. So it doesn't make any sense to group by. I may as well just say select invoice ID, comma, invoice total. I'm going to get the same thing. You see it misused lots of times. Okay, let me put this back. Let's see, I think it control, what is it? Control R? Yeah, that's the one. Somebody showed me how to do that. So this was, I'm going to put this back. That makes a whole lot more sense. Group by. Because grouping by vendor ID, that might be something I want. I want to know some information about, some aggregate information about that vendor ID. Okay. Many times you group by a foreign key. Very common. But you don't have to.
Yeah, I mean, maybe like if you want to group by the invoice, like the balance, we just see like if there's getting multiple invoices, like the same invoices.
Multiple invoices that have the same balance. If you did a group by on that, so if you grouped by the invoice total, well, that's what I did just a minute ago. I grouped by invoice total and selected the count. So I could see the invoice total of $6. I saw that I had 3 of those. And that might be valid information that you want, I guess. Questions? Uh-huh. What time is we? 10:30. I'm going to finish this up fairly quickly. Let's see, counts non-nulls. Where you will run into a little bit of a trouble is if you, let's go up here for a minute. All right. Let me, vendor address 2. Now, let's look at that. I think I'm going to get a warning here. I didn't. Many times this would generate a warning from the system because what is max? If max says, implies that it's sorting. Let's see what happens when I say min. I'll just leave it. Well, yeah. Okay, that's a string. So this is string data. And 11150 Tustin Avenue. So it's sorted by the first letter. Numbers sort before letters. What about nulls? Nulls are nothing, but are they bigger or smaller? Actually, neither makes any sense. It tosses them out. Lots of times it will warn you that there are nulls in that range. And since, give me the greatest value in there, well, nulls can't be the greatest. But if you have nulls in there, anyway, it gives you problems. What would happen if the whole range were null? If all I had were null, and I tried to say the max of a field where it was all null.
If it's all null, then wouldn't max be null?
Oh, I don't know. I can make it be all null. So I'm going to select it, but I've constrained it to be null, and it gives me null. Really, usually if you say min and max, it doesn't like nulls in that range. And lots of times you'll get an error from the system if you try. I'm used to that in Oracle. Oracle will show it to you without the nulls, but it'll warn you that you have nulls in there and they don't really sort. Now, if you order by a field that has nulls, I believe the nulls come first. It's just somebody have a question? If I just say select vendor address 2 from vendors, undo. Okay, so I have nulls in here. So if I execute this, where will the nulls appear? And the answer is the nulls appear at the beginning. So nulls are less than. I'm expecting then that if I say order by nulls descending, I want to know where will the nulls end up. What do you predict? Will they end up at the other end, or will it just put them at the first of the list? It might just put them, it might do either one. So this is one thing I'm going to have to go. So look, it put them at the end. So it's sorting nulls as less than a value. It has to put them someplace. So it puts them as it treats them as less than, but less than doesn't work on them. Okay.
Wait, so like, can you put like, does it have to? Do you have to actually put a column value? Can you put like an expression?
Put an expression. You mean in the select line?
Like when you do max.
Yeah.
You put an expression in there.
Yes.
Oh,
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So maybe there's some expression that. I don't know if this is like.
Yeah. Nulls give us trouble on sorting. and the way a particular programming language, an SQL platform, handles nulls will tend to vary across platforms. That's just life. Okay, I'll put that back and there, count, select. Okay, I don't think I need these guys. Okay, I'll give you this file. I don't know how many. Count. Okay, the new rule, if we have an aggregate function, one or more, and I have a non-aggregate function, one or more, then all of the non-aggregate functions must appear as the group by. It is possible to group by more than one field, right? For example, if I group by city name, I might have the city name might be the same in two states. For example, we have a San Diego, Texas. We have a San Diego, California. If I said group by city, San Diego, Texas, and San Diego, California will fall into one group. If I say group by city, comma, state, now San Diego, Texas will be a different group than San Diego, California. Fair enough. So it's if I were selecting this from vendors, and I wanted information, aggregate information about city and state, I would have to group it by both of them. Okay, group by having. This is the full line. Now, many people, many programmers will put the group by on one line and then enter and put the having on the next line. In my opinion, my bias, is that group by having is part of the group by. You can have a group by with no having clause, but you can't have a having without a group by. Now, think of having as a where that applies to the group. Having is like a where that applies to the group.
We can still have where clause in solving
Yes, absolutely.
and having.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the where and the having apply to different values. The where clause applies to each individual records. So if I say, what am I got here? I've got select vendor ID, invoice total, count it. So what am I totaling? What am I counting? That's in the where. So that each individual record that's getting counted or totaled or whatevered, it checks that where clause to see, does that record go in there? The having shows me which groups to print.
So the count greater than one, every vendor ID having one more than one.
Right. Let's do it without the having first. And so if this is what we had a minute ago. This was the output, and I see I got one of them with 47, but as I scroll down, I got a whole bunch of ones in there, and I got 34 rows total, so I have 34 different vendor IDs, most of them with just one. If I say, show me the groups having a count greater than one, now I'm going to get fewer than 34 rows. Okay, now I only got 12 rows, and I don't see any that have the count of one. Questions? It's pretty straightforward. Where applies to each row. Having applies to the group. When I write it, I always write group by space and then having goes there, unless I'm going to word wrap off the page. Then I'll do whatever I need to do. Let's look at another one. This one, I think I have both. Oh, one other point. Your question a moment ago where you ask which evaluates first, the select or the group by? If the select line evaluated first, I would expect to be able to use that alias that I created in the select line in the group by, but I can't. That would tend, now I'm kind of curious, group by, I think excuse me, I'm going to sneeze, I think. Change my mind. I would have expected, before you ask that question, I'd never really thought about which one happens first, but I'm going to guess that the group by happens before the select. But the bottom line, I cannot use that alias that I created on the select line in the having. I can use it in the order by, but not in the having. Okay, here's, so if I tried to say having my row count greater than 1, which I don't see why I can't, but I can't. But I can say order by my row count. All right, here's the, in all its glory. Select the vendor ID, the average, so I'm selecting the same stuff. But I only want rows. I only want vendor IDs who have the vendor city of Fresno. Now there's a Fresno, Texas. Yes, there is. I think its title is Los Fresnos. Its name, I'm not sure whether we have a Fresno, Texas or not, but if we did, they would end up in one group. Fresno's Fresno. Now, where is vendor city? Vendor city is over in the vendors table, and I'm taking my counts from the invoices table. So I'm averaging up stuff. Well, what I'm wanting is the average of the invoice total. Invoice total is in invoices. The vendor city is in vendors. Guess what I need here? My old friend, the inner join. I write a lot more inner joins than I do outer joins. Outer joins are pretty much restricted to what? There's two things. Childless parents, not orphans. Childless parents and invalid children. Children with a foreign key referencing the parent table, and there isn't a parent. Okay. I can find orphans by just looking at the child table where that foreign key is null. And so I have to inner join vendors. So I put the parent table on the left, child table on the right. You don't have to do that. I just do. Then when I link them, the parent's on the left, the child's on the right. That's method to my madness. And if you'll develop something like that as you go through into SQL and you get into advanced database programming, you're going to find out that it is not from a programming perspective, it's not hard. Well, the programming is somebody dinging me from the let's see. I need to check if I've got that many people. Okay. I'm going to check the chat every so often. If you want to communicate with me, I'll check with chat. So if you don't have a microphone, you can send me a chat, and I'll be checking that. City is Fresno. Okay, group by having, and here I'm saying the count is less than 5. Notice that the where, I've got a group by and a having, right? So I'm restricting the rows that the rows that I'm averaging only to the city of Fresno. So that's in the where clause because that applies to each individual row. Then I only want to see groups that have a count less than 5. So the where clause applies to the individual rows that are aggregated. The where clause applies before the aggregate. The having clause applies after the aggregation. Making sense? And if I execute this, I don't know how many I see. I got 11 rows and they all happen to have a row count of 1. I guess that means that I don't have any 2s or 3s or 4s. I'm hearing a ding. Is somebody trying to get my attention? I don't see any chat. Okay, I don't have you muted. But if you don't have a microphone, you'll just have to send me a chat. Questions? Well, we're just about really ready to wrap up here. Let me double check what's in my module. Data aggregation, I covered the set operations. Actually, I covered last week, and this is union and intersect and accept. Remember doing the unions? Well, they come here, and I didn't put them on test 1 because I didn't remember having them, and then I see, okay, it comes in my modules just after test 1. So here's the unions and the intersect stuff, and that's covered in this module. Test 1 is available. Aggregate functions. I don't see anything too weird there. There's the group by, there's the having, the discussion, and the assignment. Comes from chapter 5. Let's look at some of the assignments. Okay, this one comes from the assignment. Write a select statement that returns 2 columns from the invoices table, vendor ID and payment sum, where the payment sum, so I'm telling you what to alias it there, where the payment sum is the sum of the payment total column. Now we have a vendor ID, that new rule applies, vendor ID, and that it must be grouped by. I get 34 rows. Again, don't get your knickers in too big of a knot if you get something different. I think you should get 34 rows here, but you know, we're not going to get too upset if we don't. Okay. So it should be pretty straightforward. Write a select statement that returns 2 columns, vendor name, payment sum, where the payment sum is the sum, so this is the same. And we have vendor name in the select line. It must be in the group by clause. Okay. The vendor name. What on number 2? What table is the vendor name in? Vendors table. What table is the payment total in? Invoices. Okay. Now I do that one a lot because the invoice total and the payment, the vendor name, vendor information, and the payment information, invoice information, are joined by a primary key, foreign key. It's real nice joining there. You don't have to go through half a dozen tables to get there. It won't always be so nice, but when you have something from vendors table, something from invoices table, it's inner join time.
When you say something not so nice, you mean like requiring multiple joins?
Well, yeah, if I needed something from that was in the, if I something about the vendors table and something about the GL accounts table, general ledger accounts, then I would have to go through, I would have to follow it through. I think I would have 4 tables in the join.
Like invoices.
I think I would have vendors, invoices, invoice line items, and general ledger accounts. Okay. We'll be talking something about that. Now, group by vendor name or by payment time. This time I get 33 rows. But wait a minute, I got 34 rows when I was selecting vendor ID. And I get 33 rows when I select the vendor name. Something is not kosher in our world. What do you think that might be?
Null vendor name.
I could have a null vendor name. In that case, I would still have a row there and it would just show null. I have an invalid vendor ID in the invoices table is what it amounts to. And I believe I ask you to find that. I believe in problem 5 from chapter 4, part B in the outer join. If you did an outer join and pointed it at the child table where the parent was null, I think you'd find a, I forget the invoice number. One of those invoice numbers has an invalid foreign key in it. Therefore, it will not appear in the inner join. Okay. But when I had just on number 1, I didn't have an inner join. Number 1, I was just taking everything from that, and I was just taking just the vendor ID that I had in the invoices table. Now, when I do an inner join, I have one of them in there that's not matching anything. So that's telling me, that's reinforcing the idea that I forget what you got in there, but it tells us something. Review problem 5 from chapter 4, part B, the last chapter, and that therein you should have found that one that was invalid. Anyway, select statement. This is pretty much invoice count, grouping by. All of these are grouped by, all of these are plain old select. Now, number 5. Number 5, I'm saying that query number 4 has an issue in that how do we know that we don't have 2 or more different account number values with identical account descriptions? There's nothing stopping that in my database. So if I'm grouping by account description, how do I know I won't have duplicates? In that case, they will all fall together in one group. I'm going to let you think about that. let's see, how many do I have here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I've got 6. This is a having. No, this is a where. It's got a having, and I'm saying add a where clause. 7 and 8. The count, by the way, the count, I didn't do count distinct. Count, let's see. Count distinct is a little bit different from a count in that it counts it counts duplicates as 2. So, or if I have 2 duplicates, so if I say count first name, and my first name is Stephen, if there is another Stephen in here, if I just say count, that's going to be 1. If I say count distinct, that would be 2. Okay, I'm going to let you go ahead and get started on this, and I will keep the I'll just pause the recording, and it's break time anyway. So I'll pause the recording, and if I have any questions from online, I'll be here to answer them, so I'm not leaving. Do I have any questions from my online people? I think I've got you all unmuted. So you can unmute yourself now if you have a microphone. Okay, I'm going to pause the recording. We're going to take a break. And I don't plan to go any further in lecture today. I'm going to be here, and this is your time to get started on it. And you guys that are with us online may also get started on it. And I will be here. The connection to Zoom will stay active, so I can talk to you online, or we can talk on chat. I'll leave my chat window open, and I'm going to take the, I'm going to pause the recording, and I'll take off my headset.